Welcome to Boring Past Times, where the forgotten corners of history unfold in slow, steady detail. Tonight, we drift into the quiet corridors of Renaissance France, where Catherine de Medici, the so-called Poison Queen, moved carefully among nobles, whispers, and rumors. This is not the history of battles and triumphs, but of daily rituals, faint intrigues, and the subtle threads that shaped an empire. So settle in, close your eyes, and let the uneventful but strangely important past carry you toward sleep. Story 1. The Italian heiress arrives in France. You might imagine that royal courts are always bustling with grand events and spectacular intrigue. But much of life for a young noblewoman arriving in a foreign land is filled with patience, observation, and careful adaptation. Catherine de Medici, born on April 13, 1519, in Florence, was the daughter of Lorenzo II de Medici, Duke of Urbino, and Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, a French noblewoman. Yet even at birth, her life was poised between promise and precarity. Her father died when she was just a child, leaving her in the guardianship of relatives and a precarious inheritance. Her position in Florence, delicate and fragile, the Medici family, by Catherine's birth, was no stranger to influence, wealth, and the mercurial nature of politics. They had moved from bankers to rulers, and their lives were a mixture of opulence, political calculation, and, often, the careful management of enemies. Catherine's early years were spent surrounded by tutors, governesses, and attendants, learning languages, etiquette, and the arts of negotiation, all of which would serve her later at the French court. Yet the Florence she knew was confined and tightly ordered, more about observation than freedom, more about survival than pleasure. At age 14, Catherine's life took a dramatic turn. The French royal family, looking to secure alliances in Italy, arranged her marriage to Henry, the second son of King Francis I, for the young Catherine. This meant leaving Florence forever, boarding a ship with strangers, and traveling hundreds of miles through unfamiliar lands to reach a court governed by rules she had yet to learn. You can imagine her feelings: awe at the grand castles glimpsed along the journey, fear of the unknown, and the faint, persistent hope that she would find a place in a world so vastly different from the streets and gardens of Florence. Arriving in France, Catherine was thrust into a court that was, by all accounts, chaotic and overwhelming. The French court of the 1530s was a maze of ceremonies, etiquette, and competition. She was expected to learn the subtleties of conversation, the precise timing of bows and curtsies, and the often unspoken politics of court factions. Every smile, every glance, and every word was observed and recorded, either in memory or by the silent chroniclers of court life. Here, the mundane details mattered as much as the dramatic. Which chair she sat in at a banquet, which ordered the servants served the wine. Even the length of her skirts or the cut of her sleeves could affect her reputation. Catherine's initial role was not simply as a bride, but as a carefully calculated instrument of diplomacy. Marriages among royalty were seldom about affection. They were tools for alliances, claims, and influence. Catherine's youth, intelligence, and Florentine heritage made her an ideal candidate to bridge two powerful cultures. Yet, as she moved into her new home, she had to navigate the French language, the shifting loyalties of nobles, and the subtle, constant tests of her character. The young Medici quickly realized that survival at court required more than beauty. It required attention, patience, and a willingness to adapt without appearing desperate or weak. One of the more mundane aspects of Catherine's early days in France was learning the intricate clothing rituals demanded of a queen waiting. She had to understand the seasonal fabrics, the symbolism of colors, and the subtle messages that embroidered details conveyed. Red, for instance, could suggest boldness or even danger. Blue, loyalty and piety. Gold, wealth and divine favor. Each day, she chose garments with meticulous care, aware that her appearance broadcasted messages, both intentional and unintended. Even her undergarments were regulated, designed to mold her figure to the court's expectations. These details, boring to an outsider, were crucial in a court where missteps could lead to ridicule, isolation, or worse. Catherine also had to learn the rhythms of courtly entertainment. Feasts, dances, tournaments, and hunts were not just leisure. They were stages upon which power was displayed and alliances subtly reinforced. A misstep during a dance or a failure to react appropriately to a jest could cost a noblewoman her favor. Catherine, who had grown up in the relative quiet of Florence's palaces, now had to master not only the physical movements but the social choreography of this new world. Her tutors, some native French, some Italian, guided her, but the lessons were endless, and every encounter a test of her intelligence and adaptability. Food, too, was a domain of subtle politics. The French court placed immense importance on the presentation, order, and consumption of meals. Certain dishes were associated with status, wealth, or even favor with the king. Catherine had to learn not only to eat gracefully, but also to recognize the symbolism in what was served to her. For example, the lavish appearance of a roasted swan might indicate a demonstration of power and prestige by its host, while a simple dish could carry hidden messages about humility or piety. Every morsel, every toast, every sip of wine was a lesson in reading intentions and expectations. Yet Catherine was not merely passive in this environment. Even in her first months in France, she observed, remembered, and calculated. She noticed the subtle hierarchies among women, the whispered alliances and rivalries, the quiet gestures that signaled approval or disdain. While outwardly compliant, she was quietly forming strategies, mental maps of the people, their motivations, and the possible pathways she could take to secure her position. For a girl of 14, this was a remarkable task, requiring patience, memory, and a composure that would later become her hallmark. Despite the challenges, Catherine's presence in France had its moments of fascination and beauty. She was introduced to French gardens, sprawling estates, and festivals unlike anything she had seen in Florence. She observed artisans at work, musicians performing in grand halls, and the intricate ceremonies of the king and his court. These details, while seemingly mundane, would leave lasting impressions on her and shape her tastes, her sensibilities, and her eventual patronage of the arts. The transition from Florence to France was also marked by personal adjustments. Catherine, young and far from her family, had to contend with homesickness, the grief of loss, and the daunting task of building a new life among people who were, at first, strangers. Letters from her Italian relatives arrived infrequently, and the cultural distance was more than just a language barrier. was an ocean of etiquette, custom, and expectation that she had to navigate daily. Every interaction required careful consideration. Every word weighed for potential consequence. As the months passed, Catherine began to settle into her role, yet the court remained a place of constant observation. Even the smallest gestures could be interpreted. The Medici girl, who had traveled so far from home, was learning that survival required both patience and subtlety. She would have to understand the personalities of her future husband, his family, and the network of courtiers who governed the rhythm of daily life. And though she was young, she was already beginning to see the power of influence, the value of discretion, and the intricate interplay between action and perception. By the end of her first year in France, Catherine had begun to find her footing. She was learning the language with greater fluency, understanding the court's unspoken rules, and quietly observing the political landscape. Yet even as she adapted, questions lingered in her mind. How would she navigate her marriage to a prince she barely knew? Could a foreign girl secure her place in a court defined by intrigue and suspicion? And most importantly, what would it take for her to survive in, eventually thrive in, a world where every action had consequence, and every detail, no matter how small, could alter the course of her life? It is in this delicate balance between adaptation and observation, between compliance and strategy, that Catherine de Medici began her journey, not yet the feared and legendary Poison Queen, but a young woman learning the rhythms, dangers, and quiet triumphs of court life. And yet, even as she adjusted to her new an unresolved question lingered. Could a teenage girl from Florence truly hold influence in a court teeming with ambition, suspicion, and power struggles, or would she be swallowed by it? As Catherine de Medici began her second year in France, the initial awe of her surroundings gave way to the steady rhythm of court life. The grand halls, polished floors, and gilded ceilings no longer seemed entirely foreign. They became a stage upon which she had to act with precision and care. By now, she had learned some of the subtleties of French language and etiquette, but the court remained a labyrinth of alliances, rivalries, and constant observation. One of the first lessons Catherine encountered in real terms was the delicate art of navigating the factions at court. French politics in the 16th century were not organized neatly around party lines or fixed policies. Instead, influence moved fluidly, passing from one powerful noble family to another, shifting according to marriages, military successes, and personal favor with the king. Catherine quickly understood that her survival and eventual influence depended on her ability to read these subtle dynamics and to position herself carefully among them. She observed how senior ladies, often far older and more experienced than herself, wielded power through conversation, glances, and gestures. A simple smile, a slightly raised eyebrow, or the timing of a curtsy could signal approval, disapproval, or expectation. Catherine began to practice these gestures herself, refining her posture, expression, and timing. In doing so, she transformed from a wide-eyed foreign girl into a quietly calculating young woman, capable of adapting to the court's unspoken rules. Yet daily life at the French court was not entirely dominated by political strategy. There was a mundane, almost ritualistic rhythm to Catherine's existence. She rose early to attend prayers or religious ceremonies, partook in lessons on language, etiquette, and dance, and spent hours learning to manage her wardrobe. Her attire was no trivial matter. Layers of silk and velvet, delicate lace collars, and carefully chosen accessories all communicated social standing and personal virtue. Color, texture, and style were laden with meaning, and Catherine learned to navigate this complex code, choosing her appearance to convey loyalty, grace, or modest ambition. Meals were another arena of subtle social power. Banquets were not simply opportunities to eat. They were performances in observation, hierarchy, and etiquette. Catherine noted the order in which dishes were presented, the portion sizes, and the subtle signaling of preference or favor. A single gesture, accepting a toast, or hesitating before eating, could have consequences. She became attentive not only to her own actions, but to the behavior of others, cataloging moments that might reveal alliances, tensions, or rivalries. Catherine also began to observe the roles and ambitions of the men in her new life, particularly her husband, Henry, who was still a young man himself. Henry was often preoccupied with hunting, tournaments, and the pleasures of youth. Yet Catherine recognized that his favor or lack thereof would shape her influence. She noted his temperament, his interests, and the people he trusted, quietly calculating how to secure his confidence and attention. At the same time, she paid attention to his parents, particularly Francis I, whose complex personality and sharp political instincts required careful navigation. One of the more subtle challenges Catherine faced was the expectation that she produce heirs. Marriage at the royal level was not primarily a union of affection, but a duty to dynastic succession. The pressure on young brides to bear children, particularly sons, was immense, and failure could be interpreted as a personal failing or even a political liability. Catherine, however, approached this task with a measured patience, understanding that the timing of conception, health, and appearances of virtue were all interconnected in the court's calculations. Meanwhile, Catherine's education in the arts of diplomacy and influence continued. She learned to listen more than she spoke, to observe patterns of behavior, and to anticipate the needs or desires of those around her. Even seemingly mundane details, who received letters, who controlled access to the king, or who managed ceremonial events, were valuable pieces of information. By collecting these fragments, Catherine built a mental map of the court, one that would allow her to act strategically as opportunities arose. The Medici girl also became aware of the limitations and dangers of her position. Foreignness could be both an asset and a liability. Her Italian heritage marked her as exotic and intriguing, but it also made her vulnerable to suspicion, jealousy, and prejudice. Gossip, always present in court, could undermine her reputation if she Catherine understood early on that her survival required a careful balance. She had to adapt enough to fit in while retaining qualities that distinguished her as unique and valuable. Even as she navigated these challenges, Catherine found small moments of quiet influence. She began to advise her husband subtly, suggesting alliances or drawing his attention to matters he might otherwise overlook. She cultivated friendships with key figures at court, not through force, but through attentiveness, discretion, and an ability to listen and remember details. These relationships, while minor at first, laid the groundwork for the power she would wield in later years. The rhythm of daily, Life was punctuated by periods of intense ceremony and spectacle. Catherine attended tournaments, masquerades, and festivals, learning not only the entertainment but the politics behind them. Every dance, duel, or joust was a message, often layered and nuanced. Observing the reactions of nobles, the distribution of gifts, and the allocation of favors, Catherine recorded these lessons mentally, treating each event as a puzzle to decode. The knowledge she gained in these seemingly mundane moments would later prove invaluable in guiding her own political decisions. Her health and personal habits also became areas of careful management. Catherine's attendants instructed her on hygiene, diet, and exercise, each detail considered essential for a woman of her station. Even her exposure to sunlight, her consumption of certain foods, and her regimen of bathing were monitored, both for appearance and perceived moral virtue. In a world where small details could influence favor or reputation, Catherine learned to treat her body as both a tool and a statement, despite her growing competence. Catherine often reflected on the uncertainties of her position. The French court was full of ambition, envy, and danger. Every day brought the possibility of misjudgment or unforeseen events, from sudden illness to the shifting favor of a king. She understood that her survival depended on constant vigilance, subtlety, and patience. And yet, even with this awareness, she felt the stirrings of ambition and understanding that her influence could grow, if carefully nurtured, and that her intellect, discretion, and adaptability were as valuable as any dowry or title. As the years passed, Catherine's transformation was clear. The timid foreign girl had become a perceptive, patient, and strategic young woman. She had learned to read people, to anticipate outcomes, and to navigate the complex interplay of politics, etiquette, and social expectation. Her days were still filled with detail clothing, meals, ceremonies, but she now understood how these details could be leveraged to her advantage. Yet even as she gained confidence, a persistent uncertainty remained. Could a young woman, initially seen as a foreign outsider, ever wield true influence in a court dominated by ambitious men and seasoned courtiers? Or would her brilliance, patience, and observation be contained within the invisible walls of expectation, forever limiting her power? It was this uncertainty, this quiet tension between potential and limitation, that would shape Catherine de Medici's early years in France. The lessons she learned in patience, observation, and adaptation were merely the first steps in a life that would become legendary, feared, and misunderstood for generations to come. By the time Catherine de Medici entered her late teens, she had moved from cautious observer to quietly influential presence at the French court. The foreign girl who had arrived from Florence with a mixture of awe and fear had begun to understand the rhythm and undercurrents of her new world. While outward appearances of obedience, modesty, and youthfulness remained important, Catherine had discovered that influence could be exercised subtly, without confrontation or ostentation. One of the earliest signs of her emerging authority came through her role as an advisor to her husband. Henry, now increasingly aware of his responsibilities as a prince and future king. Catherine, having studied the intricate behaviors of courtiers, the alliances among noble families, and the king's own patterns of favor, began offering insights in discreet ways. These were often small gestures, a suggestion about which guest to host at a banquet, a warning regarding a nobleman's ambitions, or an observation about the king's mood that might affect a decision. Though Henry did not yet see her as a political strategist, he began to value her careful attention and calm reasoning. Noticing that Catherine's advice rarely led him astray, Catherine's influence extended beyond her husband to her interactions with the broader network of courtiers. She recognized early the importance of forging relationships with those who had long-standing power, particularly older noblewomen and trusted members of the king's household. By cultivating these connections, she could access information, observe potential threats, and slowly insert herself into discussions that shaped decisions at court. Every gift given, every conversation remembered, and every discreet compliment offered served as a building block in her quiet rise. Despite these advances, Catherine's position remained delicate. She was, after all, a foreigner, a young bride, and a woman in a male-dominated world. Suspicion was never far from the minds of those around her. Courtiers whispered about her family, questioned her motives, and speculated about her ambitions. The lessons she had learned about patience and subtlety became crucial. Any overt demonstration of power could provoke hostility or diminish the goodwill she had painstakingly built. Catherine also began to encounter the responsibilities of producing heirs, an expectation that had loomed over her since her arrival. Her early attempts to fulfill this duty were closely observed by both the king and his advisors. The pressure was immense, for a failure to bear children could jeopardize her position entirely. Yet, she approached these demands with the same careful calculation that defined her other interactions. She maintained her health, sought advice from physicians and attendants, and observed the customs surrounding conception and pregnancy in a court that was meticulous about appearances and propriety. In tandem with her personal duties, Catherine became increasingly aware of the larger political landscape of France. The country was marked by growing tension between Catholics and Protestants, complex alliances among noble families, and a monarchy striving to maintain authority amid factional struggles. Catherine's foreign perspective, combined with her keen observational skills, allowed her to see patterns that others, steeped in tradition or distracted by ceremony, often overlooked. Though she did not yet wield formal power, she began to understand the levers that could one day allow her to influence outcomes on a broader scale. Her education continued, not only through formal tutors, but through practical experience, observing the king, attending council meetings, and participating in ceremonial functions taught her lessons no classroom could provide. Catherine noted the subtleties of persuasion, the timing of argument, and the value of discretion. She learned that influence was rarely about the force of one's voice. Rather, it was a delicate interplay of suggestion, timing, and the careful reading of human behavior. Catherine's personal style also evolved during this period. Her interest in fashion, cosmetics, and personal presentation was not merely about vanity. It was a tool of subtle messaging. The way she dressed, the colors she chose, and the objects she displayed communicated her taste, her status, and her understanding of courtly symbolism. Every detail mattered, from the delicate embroidery on her gowns to the scents she wore, choices that would later contribute to her reputation as a woman of both refinement and secrecy. As Catherine navigated these layers of courtly life, she also began to witness the darker, more precarious aspects of her world. Rivalries, jealousies, and the undercurrents of intrigue were constant. Courtiers maneuvered to gain favor, alliances shifted unpredictably, and the stakes for error were extraordinarily high. Catherine's survival depended not only on her intelligence, but on her ability to anticipate, adapt, and, at times, conceal her true intentions. She learned to listen for hints of discontent, to observe the unspoken tensions in conversation, and to maintain a composure that projected both grace and self-control. Despite these challenges, Catherine's confidence grew. She began to understand that influence did not require overt confrontation. It required patience, observation, and the careful accumulation of trust. Through small but deliberate actions, she could shape perceptions, gather information, and lay the groundwork for the power she would wield in later years. The court, which initially seemed a labyrinth designed to overwhelm her, became a space in which she could operate strategically, blending subtlety with insight. By the end of this formative period, Catherine was still young, but no longer naive. She had learned to navigate the intricacies of court life, to read the intentions of those around her, and to act in ways that advanced her position without inviting overt hostility. She had survived the uncertainty of being a foreign bride and began to glimpse the possibility of influence that extended beyond her immediate household. And yet, even as she gained her footing, a lingering question remained, one that would haunt much of her life. Initially perceived as a delicate foreign bride, truly command respect, shape policy, and protect her family in a court where ambition, jealousy, and danger were constant companions. This question, unanswerable in those early years, set the stage for the complex, often misunderstood life of Catherine de Medici, the girl from Florence, who would, in time, become one of the most powerful and controversial women in French history. Her survival and the subtle mastery of influence she began to develop in these early years were only the first steps toward the legend of the Poison Queen. Story 2. Marriage to the young King. Catherine de Medici's life shifted once more with her formal introduction to Henry, the young Dauphin of France, who would later become King Henry II. By the time she was a teenager, she had already spent years acclimating to the French court, learning its etiquette, observing its power structures, and quietly practicing the skills of subtle influence. Yet marriage was a different challenge entirely, one that combined personal, political, and dynastic stakes. Arranged marriages among royalty in the 16th century were rarely about affection or companionship. They were strategic alliances, carefully negotiated to solidify peace, secure territories, or strengthen claims. Catherine's marriage to Henry was designed to reinforce the French crown's ties to Italy and, indirectly, to consolidate influence in the Mediterranean. From the perspective of diplomacy, her Florentine lineage was valuable. The Medici family carried a reputation of wealth, intellect, and, sometimes, intrigue. For Catherine, this meant that her personal value at court was tied directly to her ability to fulfill the roles assigned to her daughter: wife, advisor, and eventually mother. The marriage contract itself was a complex document outlining dowries, titles, responsibilities, and even ceremonial obligations. Catherine's dowry was substantial, reflecting the Medici's wealth, but it also signaled her worth as a political asset. Beyond material considerations, the contract detailed expectations regarding her conduct at court, the upbringing of future children, and her engagement in public ceremonies. It was, in many ways, a blueprint for a young woman's life of service, where personal desires were secondary to dynastic duty. Catherine's first meeting with Henry was carefully orchestrated, designed to maximize ceremonial grandeur and project the image of harmonious union. She was escorted to his presence with a retinue of courtiers, attendants, and musicians, each detail meticulously arranged. Clothing, posture, and timing were all calculated, emphasizing the importance of propriety, dignity, and subtle persuasion. Catherine had already learned much about the rhythms of court life, and now she applied her observational skills in a very personal context, the negotiation of her first impressions. Henry, still in his adolescence, had his own expectations and limitations. While he would one day become a powerful king, at this stage he was still learning the complexities of governance, the subtleties of diplomacy, and the pressures of dynastic responsibility. His personality was shaped by both privilege and expectation, a mixture of youthful exuberance, cautious observation, and the desire to assert himself within the strict hierarchy of French nobility. Catherine quickly realized that understanding Henry, his temperament, moods, and ambitions was as important as understanding the court itself. The early days of marriage were dominated by ceremony and observation. Catherine was introduced to the routines of the royal household, the schedules of prayers, meals, and audiences, and the labyrinthian rules of courtly etiquette. She learned which gestures pleased the king, which courtiers wielded the greatest influence, and which alliances were safest to cultivate. While these details might seem trivial from the outside, at a royal court, they were fundamental to survival and eventual power. Physical proximity to the king did not automatically translate into influence. Catherine quickly noticed that personal presence had to be combined with discretion, intelligence, and patience. Every conversation, every glance, and every carefully timed smile could communicate loyalty, charm, or strategic calculation. Over time, she honed the ability to participate in court life without drawing unwanted attention to herself, an essential skill in a world where envy and ambition could lead to sudden ruin. Beyond the immediate household, Catherine became aware of the broader political context surrounding her marriage. France was a nation marked by internal factions, regional rivalries, and tensions between noble families. The king's advisors and counselors wielded influence that could shape decisions as much as Henry himself. Catherine understood that her role as both wife and future mother of heirs intersected with these power structures. Her conduct, alliances, and judgments would have implications far beyond her personal comfort or desires. One of the most immediate pressures of marriage was the expectation of producing children. At a young age, Catherine was acutely aware that her success or failure would be judged in part by her fertility. Physicians, attendants, and court officials all monitored this aspect of her life, blending medical advice with social expectation. The first months were a mixture of hope, observation, and careful attention to health and timing, reflecting the extraordinary emphasis placed on dynastic continuity. Catherine also navigated the subtler, social aspects of married life. As Henry's wife, she was expected to entertain guests, host small gatherings, and maintain decorum in public appearances. These events were opportunities to observe allies and potential adversaries, to test relationships, and to gather information. She learned to detect nuances in conversation, subtle shifts in tone, and the underlying intentions of those who surrounded the king. Each observation added to her growing understanding of influence and power within the French court. Even as she settled into her new role, Catherine remained conscious of her foreign status. Italy and France were culturally and politically distinct, and courtiers sometimes regarded her origins with suspicion or curiosity. She had to demonstrate adaptability without sacrificing the unique qualities that made her valuable. Her intelligence, charm, and careful attention to detail allowed her to navigate these challenges, gradually earning respect while avoiding the dangers of overt assertiveness. The couple's daily life also involved shared learning and adaptation. Henry was developing as a monarch, while Catherine was learning the intricate dance of diplomacy and social influence. Their interactions were not solely personal, they were also performances for courtiers and foreign observers. Each conversation, each decision, was an exercise in careful positioning, reflecting not only personal inclination, but also dynastic strategy. Despite the constraints, Catherine began to understand that marriage was not simply an obligation, it was a platform for influence. By observing her husband, the courtiers, and the flow of daily life, she could begin to anticipate events, guide decisions subtly, and establish herself as a thoughtful, perceptive presence. Her education in patience, observation, and social nuance developed during her first years at the French court found practical application in the complex dynamics of married life. Yet even as she navigated these layers of expectation and strategy, questions persisted. Could a young bride truly shape her husband's decisions? Would her subtle influence grow into genuine authority, or would she remain confined to the ornamental role expected of royal wives? Could she balance personal survival, dynastic duty, and the ever-present expectations of courtly propriety? These uncertainties would define the early years of Catherine's marriage, setting the stage for the subtle but consequential power she would gradually wield. Even in the most mundane moments, shared meals, private conversations, ceremonial appearances, she was learning lessons that would shape the trajectory of the French monarchy and secure her place in history. The story of Catherine's early married life is not marked by dramatic battles or sensational intrigue, but by observation, patience, and careful calculation. It is in these small, deliberate actions, performed within the rigid structures of marriage and courtly life, that Catherine de Medici began to plant the seeds of influence that would later grow into her formidable reputation. And yet, an unresolved question remained. Would the careful strategies, patience, and subtle observation of a young queen be enough to protect her family, assert her influence, and survive the treacherous currents of a court dominated by ambition and rivalry? After the initial months of marriage, Catherine de Medici began to settle more firmly into her role as Henry's wife. Yet the life of a queen was never simple or predictable. While she had already learned the court's etiquette and the subtle signals of influence, marriage brought a new layer of complexity. Now she was not merely a young bride learning her. She was the Dauphine, soon to become Queen of France, with responsibilities that extended beyond herself to her husband, her household, and the intricate web of French politics. The daily routine of a royal wife was filled with details that might appear insignificant but were laden with meaning. Catherine rose early, often before dawn, to attend prayers and religious ceremonies. Her presence, a symbol of piety and devotion. These rituals were observed carefully by courtiers and attendants, who noted her posture, her expressions, and even the subtle nuances of her devotion. Each gesture was both a personal practice and a public performance, blending devotion with social expectation. Catherine's days were also consumed with the management of her household. The Queen's household was a microcosm of the court itself, a network of ladies-in-waiting, maids, attendants, and advisors, each with their own ambitions, loyalties, and rivalries. As the head of this intricate structure, Catherine had to maintain discipline, distribute favor, and navigate disputes with discretion. Small oversights could be interpreted as weakness, while careful attention to her household's order reinforced her authority. She learned early that leadership often came in the form of subtle management, rather than overt command. At the same time, Catherine was tasked with producing heirs a duty that carried both personal and political weight. Physicians and attendants closely monitored her health, offering advice that combined medical theory, superstition, and social expectation. She was expected to maintain not only her fertility, but also her appearance and composure, balancing personal comfort with the public image of a capable, virtuous queen. The pressure was immense, yet Catherine approached this duty with quiet determination, carefully navigating the timing, rituals, and advice surrounding conception and pregnancy. Courtly life also demanded constant attention to alliances and rivalries. Catherine had to learn who held influence over the king, which families were aligned or opposed, and where danger might arise. She discovered that influence was rarely wielded through direct confrontation. It came through observation, subtle intervention, and careful positioning. A whispered suggestion, a timely gift, or a discreet observation could shift perceptions, earning loyalty or neutralizing threats. Catherine's intelligence and patience became her tools, allowing her to operate within a highly competitive and often perilous environment. The couple's public appearances were another arena of subtle power. Catherine learned to navigate banquets, dances, tournaments, and processions with the precision demanded of a queen. Her posture, gestures, and expressions were scrutinized, and each movement carried the potential to enhance or undermine her reputation. She also began to understand the value of silence, listening carefully, observing interactions, and intervening only when it served a calculated purpose. These skills, honed over years of careful observation, would later define her approach to governance and diplomacy. Catherine's relationship with Henry also evolved during this period. While their marriage was not founded on affection, mutual respect began to develop. Henry increasingly sought her counsel on matters of domestic and political importance, recognizing the clarity and insight that Catherine brought to discussions. Her intelligence and patience allowed her to advise without appearing overbearing, guiding decisions subtly while ensuring that the king retained the perception of authority. This delicate balance was essential in a court where power was intertwined with perception, even as she gained influence. Catherine faced the persistent threat of intrigue. Courtiers were ambitious, jealous, and constantly maneuvering for advantage. Rivalries could erupt over minor slights, while alliances shifted unpredictably. Catherine learned to detect subtle cousin inflection in a voice, a glance, or a hesitation in conversation that might signal discontent or plotting. These observations became a form of early intelligence gathering, allowing her to anticipate potential challenges and act with foresight. Her foreign origins continued to be both an asset and a liability. On one hand, her Medici heritage lent her a sense of exoticism and cultural sophistication that intrigued courtiers and foreign envoys alike. On the other, it made her the subject of suspicion and occasional prejudice, requiring careful management of perceptions and relationships. Catherine's strategy was to adapt where necessary, assert her intelligence subtly, and allow her competence to speak through action rather than argument. Catherine also expanded her role in cultural and ceremonial matters. She began to oversee festivals, entertainments, and religious events, ensuring that they reflected both the dignity of the monarchy and her personal taste. Through these activities, she shaped the cultural life of the court, influencing fashion, decor, and the arts. These contributions, though often considered secondary to political maneuvering, reinforced her presence and authority in ways that were both visible and symbolic. Despite these successes, Catherine remained aware of her vulnerabilities. The court was unpredictable, and every decision carried potential risk. The birth of heirs, the favor of the king, and the opinions of powerful courtiers all influenced her standing. She knew that survival and eventual influence required constant vigilance, discretion, and a willingness to act strategically, even in mundane matters. Through careful observation, patience, and subtle intervention, Catherine began to consolidate her influence. She learned that true power often lay not in overt displays of authority, but in shaping perception, guiding decisions behind the scenes, and cultivating loyalty through attention and prudence. Her early experiences as a royal wife were laying the foundation for a lifetime of strategic action, where subtlety and foresight would be as valuable as any military campaign or political decree. Yet, even as she navigated these challenges, a lingering question persisted. Could a queen, operating quietly and subtly within the constraints of marriage and courtly expectation, ever assert the kind of influence necessary to protect her family, shape policy, and survive the relentless intrigue of the French court? It was this question, unresolved and persistent, that defined Catherine de Medici's early married years. In the interplay of daily ritual, subtle observation, and careful intervention, she was learning the strategies that would later allow her to emerge not merely as a queen by marriage, but as a figure whose influence and legacy would shape the course of French history. As Catherine de Medici entered her late teens, her position as Henry's wife solidified, yet the life of a queen was far from secure. The French court, with its shifting alliances, relentless observation, and constant maneuvering, remained a place where even small errors could have lasting consequences. Catherine had spent years learning etiquette, observing behavior, and practicing patience. But now her skills would be tested in more immediate and consequential ways. One of the earliest and most pressing challenges was securing the favor of Henry himself. While he had begun to value her counsel, Henry was still young, navigating the responsibilities of future kingship alongside the pleasures and distractions of adolescence. Catherine had to balance deference with subtle influence, ensuring that her advice was heard without threatening his authority. Every conversation, every suggestion had to be framed carefully, delivered with discretion, and reinforced through consistent reliability. She quickly learned that consistency and quiet intelligence could build more influence than bold assertions. Beyond her husband, Catherine had to manage the intricate hierarchy of the Queen's household. Ladies in waiting, maids, and attendants each carried their own ambitions, rivalries, and allegiances. Catherine had to supervise them carefully, using diplomacy, observation, and subtle incentives to maintain order. A misstep could lead to gossip, the undermining of authority, or even the loss of influence over the inner workings of the court. Through patience and meticulous attention to detail, Catherine began to assert control over her household, not through overt command, but through strategic guidance and careful observation. The political environment beyond the household posed its own complexities. France in the 1540s was a kingdom marked by noble rivalries, regional disputes, and growing religious tensions. Catherine quickly recognized that her influence, limited though it might seem, could be exerted through alliances, subtle interventions, and careful management of perception. She observed which families held sway, which courtiers were ambitious, and which factions were vulnerable, gradually assembling a mental map of power that would guide her future actions. Catherine's education in patience and discretion proved invaluable in this environment. She became adept at reading subtle cues and inflection in conversation, a fleeting glance, or a hesitation in speech that revealed intent, dissatisfaction, or opportunity. These observations allowed her to act strategically, offering advice, forging relationships, and occasionally intervening in disputes, all while remaining within the boundaries of propriety expected of a queen. The matter of producing heirs continued to weigh heavily on Catherine. Court physicians monitored her health, offering advice that combined medical theory, superstition, and social expectation. The pressure to bear children was immense, and Catherine approached it with a mixture of patience, diligence, and strategic planning. Her eventual success in conceiving provided not only personal relief, but also a foundation of legitimacy, securing her position within the royal household and allowing her influence to grow. Cultural and ceremonial responsibilities offered another avenue for subtle influence. Catherine oversaw festivals, religious events, and entertainments, using them to reinforce her presence and project the image of a competent, cultured, and virtuous queen. Through careful management of these events, she shaped perceptions, strengthened alliances, and subtly guided the court's social and political rhythms. Even seemingly minor decisions, such as seating arrangements, choice of music, or the allocation of gifts carried significant weight in reinforcing her influence. At the same time, Catherine remained conscious of the ever-present dangers of court life. Rivalries, jealousy, and ambition were constant threats. The slightest miscalculation could lead to gossip, diminished favor, or political isolation. Catherine's strategy was one of observation, subtle intervention, and patience, allowing her to protect herself and her family while gradually expanding her sphere of influence. By now, Catherine had begun to establish herself as a figure whose intelligence, discretion, and subtlety were recognized by those around her. She was still young, but she had demonstrated the ability to navigate complex social and political environments, to anticipate challenges, and to act with careful calculation. The early years of her marriage, marked by observation, learning, and cautious intervention, laid the groundwork for her later prominence as a queen who would wield influence not through direct confrontation, but through strategy, patience, and the quiet exercise of power. Yet, even as she succeeded in these small but critical ways, a lingering question remained. Could Catherine maintain her influence as pressures grew, managing the ambitions of courtiers, the expectations of the king, and the weighty responsibility of ensuring her family's future without exposing herself to the dangers that had claimed the favor or lives of so many who came before her? This question, unresolved during her early years as queen, was emblematic of Catherine de Medici's life. It highlighted the delicate balance she had to maintain between survival, influence, and the relentless demands of the French court. Through patience, observation, and strategic subtlety, Catherine began to prove that a young queen could shape events quietly yet decisively, a lesson that would define much of her later life. Story 3. Life at the French court. The French court in the mid-16th century was a world defined less by sweeping battles or grand political decrees, and more by the meticulous rhythms of daily life, ceremony, and observation. For Catherine de Medici, already acclimated to courtly routines as Henry's wife, these details were both a challenge and an opportunity. Survival and eventually influence depended on mastering the subtleties of etiquette, the intricate choreography of social interaction, and the quiet mechanics of power that unfolded in every corridor, hall, and chamber of the palace. Each day began before dawn. Catherine rose early, attended prayers, and participated in religious ceremonies that were as much about display as devotion. Courtiers watched closely. A bowed head, a measured gesture, or a slight hesitation could communicate virtue, humility, or, conversely, aloofness. In a court obsessed with appearances, these seemingly mundane acts were potent signals. Catherine learned to perform them flawlessly, understanding that each gesture was both a personal practice and a public statement. The queen's attire was another arena in which influence was exercised. Catherine's wardrobe consisted of layers of silk, velvet, lace, and fine embroidery, each piece chosen to reflect rank, piety, or political signaling. Colors carried meaning: blue for loyalty, red for power, gold for divine favor. Even the smallest accessory, a brooch, a pendant, or the arrangement of a sleeve, was laden with significance. Catherine learned to select garments not only for comfort or style, but as tools to communicate intentions, reinforce alliances, or subtly assert status within the hierarchy of the court. Meals were similarly ritualized. Banquets were complex performances, where the order of service, seating arrangements, and even the choice of dishes carried social and political weight. Catherine observed which courtiers received the king's attention, the portion sizes distributed to different attendees, and the subtle cues of favor or disapproval embedded in the presentation of food. Learning to navigate these moments required attention, memory, and an understanding of both social and political nuance. A poorly timed gesture, a misread signal, or a lapse in composure could diminish her influence or alienate potential allies. Daily life was punctuated by ceremonies, audiences, and formal gatherings. Catherine attended these events not simply as a participant, but as an observer, noting the alliances, tensions, and hierarchies at play. She recorded in her memory the behavior of courtiers, the subtle signals of status, and the shifts in loyalty that often occurred without any overt confrontation. In this environment, observation was a skill as valuable as intelligence, and patience often yielded more advantage than boldness. Catherine's household was a microcosm of the broader court, with its own hierarchies, rivalries, and obligations. Managing it required constant vigilance. Ladies-in-waiting, attendants, and advisors each had ambitions, loyalties, and grievances that could influence the court at large. Catherine learned to intervene subtly, rewarding loyalty, mitigating conflict, and using discretion to maintain authority. Her control was rarely overt. It operated through guidance, example, and the careful distribution of favor beyond managing appearances and her household. Catherine developed a keen understanding of the dynamics of courtly politics. She observed which families held influence over the king, who aligned with whom, and how shifts in behavior could signal emerging power struggles. Through this vigilance, she began to see how influence was wielded not through direct action alone, but through perception, information, and the careful orchestration of relationships. Her foreign origins, once a potential liability, became an asset. She could navigate factions with an outsider's perspective, noting subtleties that insiders overlooked. Cultural patronage also offered Catherine a subtle avenue of influence. She began to engage with artists, architects, and musicians, overseeing festivals, entertainments, and decorations for court events. These contributions, while appearing ceremonial or decorative, reinforced her presence and authority. By shaping cultural expressions, Catherine could signal taste, intelligence, and refinement qualities that enhanced her reputation and positioned her as a central figure in court life. The French court's social choreography extended even into the smallest interactions. Every conversation, every exchange of letters, every greeting or dismissal carried layered meaning. Catherine learned to read inflections, pauses, and gestures, understanding that intention often lay beneath words. By listening carefully and observing consistently, she gathered knowledge that allowed her to intervene strategically, advise discreetly, and protect her position. Influence, she realized, was often invisible. It worked through shaping perception and guiding outcomes rather than commanding directly. Health and personal discipline were also critical. Court life demanded that Catherine maintain her appearance, stamina, and composure at all times. She adhered to strict regimens of diet, exercise, and hygiene, as well as the elaborate rituals surrounding makeup, bathing, and grooming. Every element contributed to the perception of virtue, competence, and refinement, reinforcing her authority without a word being spoken. Despite these outward successes, Catherine remained aware of the fragility of her position. Ambition, jealousy, and intrigue were constant companions of court life. A careless remark, an unnoticed slight, or a failure to read a social cue could undermine her carefully constructed reputation. She understood that survival required vigilance, patience, and a readiness to act decisively when necessary. Every day presented a subtle test, the balance between adaptation and assertion, observation and intervention, caution and influence. Through these countless small actions, Catherine began to consolidate her presence at court. She was learning the art of influence as a craft, a combination of observation, discretion, and subtle guidance. Each ritual, meal, audience, and interaction became part of a broader tapestry, a network of knowledge and relationships that allowed her to operate strategically. While she was not yet exercising formal political authority, her quiet mastery of court life laid the foundation for the formidable power she would wield in later years. Yet even amidst the careful orchestration of daily life, a persistent question remained. Could mastery of etiquette, observation, and subtle influence truly translate into lasting authority in a court? Intrigue, and the ever-present dangers of perception. This question lingered in the background of Catherine's early life at the French court, shaping her approach to power and foreshadowing the ways in which she would navigate the perilous and intricate world of monarchy. As Catherine de Medici continued to settle into court life, she realized that survival and influence required far more than simply adhering to etiquette and ceremonial expectations. The French court was a web of subtle power plays, hidden rivalries, and intricate alliances. Every glance, gesture, and whispered word carried weight. The young queen understood that to secure her position, she needed not only to perform her public role flawlessly, but also to develop a keen sense of the underlying currents that shaped the behavior of those around her. The court's social hierarchy was rigid, yet fluid in practice. Nobles jostled for favor, sometimes through open displays of loyalty, but more often through subtle manipulation and observation. Catherine's early education in observation now became essential. She began cataloging courtiers' tendencies, noting which individuals sought influence through charm, flattery, or strategic alliances. By understanding these patterns, she could anticipate conflicts, identify potential allies, and avoid being caught in disputes that might threaten her standing. One of the most important aspects of Catherine's influence was her relationship with the king. Henry's youth and occasional inexperience presented both a challenge and an opportunity. Catherine could guide decisions subtly, offering insight without appearing to assert authority directly. Over time, Henry came to value her judgment, recognizing that her careful attention to court dynamics and social subtleties often revealed truths he might have overlooked. This growing trust became a cornerstone of her early influence, even as she remained cautious about appearing overly assertive. Catherine's household continued to serve as both a tool and a testing ground for her emerging skills. She learned to manage not only daily operations, but also the ambitions, rivalries, and expectations of her staff. Small missteps favoring one attendant over another, failing to notice a slight, or mishandling a dispute could reverberate through the court. By exercising patience, discretion, and strategic attention, Catherine maintained control, ensuring that her household reflected her authority and reinforced her presence at court. Religious observance and piety were also essential tools of influence. The French court placed great emphasis on moral virtue, and the Queen's behavior was constantly scrutinized. Catherine's participation in prayers, ceremonies, and charitable acts was not merely personal practice, but a deliberate signal of competence, devotion, and propriety. These public displays reinforced her reputation and subtly strengthened her authority, even in areas of life that seemed removed from politics. Education, too, continued to shape Catherine's understanding of power. She observed the negotiations, ceremonies, and audiences that defined the court, noting which arguments succeeded, which gestures conveyed authority, and which mistakes led to diminished favor. She realized that influence was often less about formal decrees and more about perception. A well-timed smile, a discreet suggestion, or an unspoken agreement could achieve outcomes that overt action might not. Catherine's foreign origins remained a double-edged sword. Her Italian heritage provided an exotic allure and a reputation for sophistication, but it also exposed her to suspicion and gossip. She carefully balanced adaptation with the preservation of her unique qualities, learning to integrate into French customs while using her background as a subtle advantage. Observing and understanding both cultures allowed her to navigate alliances, anticipate rivalries, and position herself as a figure whose insight and composure were valued by allies and respected by opponents. Ceremonial occasions, banquets, tournaments, and festivals offered additional arenas for influence. Catherine learned to orchestrate these events to reinforce social hierarchies, reward loyalty, and cultivate alliances. Even minor details, such as seating arrangements or the presentation of gifts, were laden with meaning. Through careful attention to these nuances, she could subtly signal preference, demonstrate judgment, and strengthen her position without overt confrontation. Appearance and personal discipline were equally critical. The Queen's composure, physical presence, and ability to maintain energy for long ceremonies and audiences reflected both personal capability and public authority. Catherine adhered to careful regimens of diet, hygiene, and exercise, understanding that even small lapses could affect perception. In a world where appearance was intertwined with influence, maintaining control over one's body was part of the broader strategy of power. Despite her growing competence, Catherine remained aware of the court's fragility. Alliances could shift overnight, favor could be withdrawn, and small miscalculations could have disproportionate consequences. She learned to approach each situation with caution, patience, and foresight, recognizing that influence was a continual process rather than a static achievement. Her success depended on observation, subtle intervention, and the ability to anticipate events before they became crises. Through these lessons, Catherine began to exercise a form of quiet authority that distinguished her from other courtiers. She was not a figure of overt power. She did not dominate conversation or command attention by force. Instead, she shaped outcomes subtly, guided decisions through suggestion, and cultivated loyalty through careful observation and discretion. Each success reinforced her confidence. A lingering question persisted. Could a queen, whose power depended on subtlety and observation rather than formal authority, maintain influence in a court where ambition, intrigue, and the unpredictable whims of the king constantly threatened stability? This uncertainty defined Catherine de Medici's life at court during these formative years. Every ritual, every interaction, and every careful gesture became part of a larger strategy and ongoing exercise in survival, influence, and preparation for the challenges that history would soon place squarely in her path. As Catherine de Medici settled further into her role at the French court, she began to face challenges that tested her patience, judgment, and growing understanding of power. The court, once a place of observation and subtle maneuvering, became a theater in which the stakes of survival, influence, and family security were vividly apparent. These early crises, both personal and political, revealed the extent to which Catherine's intelligence, caution, and discretion would define her future. One of the earliest crises involved her relationship with Henry himself. Though he had begun to value her counsel, he was still subject to the whims and distractions of youth, courtly culture, and the demands of his advisors. Catherine needed to ensure that her advice was heard without overstepping, a delicate task in which timing and subtlety were essential. She discovered that influence was often more effectively exercised by creating the conditions in which the king's choices aligned with her guidance, rather than issuing direct commands or criticisms. This lesson would become central to her approach throughout her life, shaping outcomes invisibly, yet decisively beyond her husband. Catherine confronted the ambitions and rivalries of the court's powerful families. Noble factions jostled for influence, often seeking to undermine one another or curry favor with the young king. Catherine's understanding of alliances, loyalties, and subtle social cues allowed her to navigate these treacherous waters. She began discreetly rewarding loyalty, mediating minor disputes, and offering support to those whose influence could bolster her position. Each action reinforced her reputation as a perceptive, reliable figure, even as she remained careful to avoid overt confrontation. The pressure to produce heirs continued to shape Catherine's life. Each pregnancy was a public matter, closely scrutinized by courtiers and physicians alike. The health and survival of both mother and child were never guaranteed, and Catherine had to navigate both physical challenges and the expectations of a court that measured her worth in dynastic terms. Successfully bearing children not only secured her position, but also provided leverage in her interactions with the king and other members of the court. Through careful attention to health, timing, and ritual, Catherine managed to meet these expectations, reinforcing her value and gradually building her influence. Religious tensions in France added another layer of complexity. While Catherine herself was Catholic, factionalism and local unrest created a backdrop of uncertainty that touched nearly every aspect of governance and social life. Catherine began observing the ways in which religion intersected with politics, noting which families and courtiers aligned with which factions, and understanding how alliances and rivalries were shaped by faith as well as ambition. This awareness allowed her to act with strategic foresight, intervening when necessary to protect her family or stabilize situations without drawing overt attention. Catherine's role in ceremonial and cultural life continued to expand. Banquets, processions, and court entertainments became arenas in which she could exercise subtle influence. By shaping these events, Catherine controlled not only appearances, but also the flow of favor, attention, and opportunity. Her choices in seating, gifts, music, and spectacle signaled preference, rewarded loyalty, and subtly reminded courtiers of her presence and judgment. Through these seemingly decorative acts, she demonstrated an early mastery of the symbolic power that would become a hallmark of her reign. Personal relationships at court were equally significant. Catherine cultivated alliances with women and men who held influence or access to critical information. Courtiers, who once viewed her as a foreign, inexperienced bride, began to recognize her as a perceptive, discreet, and strategic figure. Through attentive listening, careful observation, and measured intervention, she began to shape perceptions and outcomes in ways that enhanced her authority without threatening the fragile social order. Even as her competence grew, Catherine remained conscious of her vulnerabilities. Ambition, jealousy, and miscalculation could still undermine her efforts. The court demanded constant vigilance, and every interaction was a potential test of judgment. Catherine's strategy became one of layered preparation, anticipating challenges, maintaining alliances, and ensuring that her interventions were deliberate, subtle, and aligned with long-term objectives. In essence, she transformed ordinary court life into a landscape of strategic opportunity, where survival and influence were inseparable. By the end of this early period at court, Catherine had established herself as a figure whose influence, while subtle, was undeniable. She was no longer merely a young queen navigating unfamiliar rituals and expectations. She had become an observer, strategist, and quietly assertive presence. Her ability to read intentions, manage relationships, and act with discretion set her apart from other courtiers, and laid the foundation for the formidable authority she would later wield. Yet, even as she demonstrated these early successes, a persistent and unresolved question lingered. Could a queen who relied on subtlety, patience, and observation maintain lasting influence in a court where ambition, intrigue, and danger were constant, and ultimately survive the political storms that awaited her in the years ahead? This question, unresolved in these formative years, would shadow Catherine de Medici throughout her life. But it was here, amidst the rituals, rivalries, and quiet exercises of influence at the French court, that the seeds of her enduring legacy were planted in. Enduring legacy built not on overt power, but on the patient, careful, and calculated mastery of human behavior. Story 4. Catherine's struggle to produce an heir. For Catherine de Medici, one of the earliest and most pressing challenges of her married life was producing an heir. While she had learned the subtle arts of observation, influence, and survival at court, the expectation to bear children carried a weight unlike any other. Fertility was not merely a personal or private matter. It was a dynastic, political, and social obligation. The survival of her position, her family, and her influence depended on her ability to fulfill this duty. In the 16th century French court, the queen's primary role was the continuation of the royal lineage, the political stability of the kingdom, the succession of the monarchy, and the management of alliances rested upon her capacity to produce heirs. Each pregnancy was an event of immense scrutiny, observed not only by the king and courtiers, but also by physicians, attendants, and the broader nobility. A queen who failed to bear children risked marginalization, loss of influence, or even replacement, a reality that Catherine would never forget. The first years of her marriage were filled with anticipation, hope, and anxiety. Court physicians, trained in the medical theories of the era, closely monitored her diet, routines, and bodily health. Advice ranged from the practicals, such as recommendations on nutrition and rest, to the superstitious, with rituals, charms, and prayers intended to encourage conception. Catherine, methodical and observant by nature, incorporated these recommendations into her daily life, seeking every possible advantage while remaining aware of the precarious nature of her situation. Pregnancy itself was a source of both relief and peril. The physical demands on the queen were considerable. She was expected to maintain her composure, continue public appearances, and perform ceremonial duties, all while managing the complex social and domestic responsibilities of her household. Miscarriage, illness, or complications were common and could endanger both mother and child. Catherine approached these risks with a combination of diligence, careful attention to her health, and reliance on the expertise of her attendants and physicians, who often combined observation with ritualized practices. The pressures surrounding fertility were compounded by the king's expectations and the broader political implications. Henry's position as heir to the throne required the certainty of succession, and his advisors were constantly aware of the potential for instability should the royal line fail. Catherine's ability to conceive and bear healthy children was thus intertwined with political security. Each successful pregnancy reinforced her legitimacy, strengthened her standing, and provided her with leverage in navigating court alliances and rivalries. Catherine's personal experience of this burden was intense and isolating. The intimate nature of reproduction, combined with its public significance, left little room for privacy or personal reflection. She was constantly observed, questioned, and advised. Her body effectively public property in a world where dynastic continuity was paramount. Yet she endured these intrusions with patience, using her careful observation and intelligence to maintain dignity and control over the circumstances as best she could. The queen also had to navigate the emotional and psychological dimensions of fertility. Each failed attempt at conception, each delayed pregnancy, was a source of anxiety and self-reflection. Catherine understood that perceived failure could be interpreted as weakness, incompetence, or unworthiness, both personally and politically. Her strategy was to maintain composure, seek medical guidance, and focus on the practical steps within her control, even as uncertainty and societal pressure loomed over her daily life. Allies and adversaries alike closely watched Catherine's efforts. Courtiers took note of each pregnancy, interpreting its success or delay as a signal of political stability or potential weakness. Rival noblewomen, some envious of Catherine's rising influence, sometimes sought to exploit rumors or uncertainties surrounding fertility to undermine her position. Catherine's ability to maintain patience, discretion, and subtle influence became essential in managing not only her reproductive life, but also the perceptions and ambitions of those around her. Medical practices of the time were a mix of observation, tradition, and superstition. Physicians monitored symptoms, suggested dietary adjustments, and prescribed treatments intended to encourage fertility. These treatments ranged from herbal remedies to bloodletting and other interventions, reflecting the limited understanding of human reproduction. Catherine's careful attention to these practices demonstrated her willingness to explore every possible avenue, while her intelligence allowed her to navigate treatments that were both beneficial and potentially harmful. Beyond the medical and physical aspects, Catherine also engaged in social and ceremonial strategies designed to support her role as mother and queen. Rituals, prayers, and the performance of piety were woven into daily routines, reinforcing her image as virtuous, dutiful, and capable. These actions had a dual purpose: to inspire faith in her own success and to signal to the court that she was fulfilling her responsibilities with diligence and moral integrity. Throughout these challenges, Catherine's patience, observation, and resilience became defining qualities. She learned to endure physical discomfort, navigate social scrutiny, and manage political implications simultaneously. Her ability to remain composed, to act with foresight, and to cultivate quiet influence ensured that even under intense pressure, she maintained authority and legitimacy. Yet, even amidst meticulous preparation, observation, and care, a persistent question haunted Catherine. Could she consistently fulfill the expectations of the court, produce heirs, and maintain influence in a realm where a queen's worth was measured as much by her ability to bear children as by her intelligence and political skill? This question, unanswerable and ever-present, would define the next stage of Catherine de Medici's life, shaping her decisions, strategies, and the subtle mastery of influence that would later become a hallmark of her reign. Her struggle to produce heirs was more than a personal challenge. It was a lesson in endurance, observation, and the quiet exertion of power in a world where survival and legacy were inseparably intertwined. Catherine de Medici's early years as queen were defined by more than ceremonial duties and courtly observations. They were defined by the intense pressures surrounding pregnancy and the production of heirs. Each pregnancy was both a personal experience and a political event, observed by the king, courtiers, physicians, and, indirectly, the entire nobility of France. The successful birth of a child was a matter of dynastic security, while failure could compromise influence, standing, and even personal safety. The queen's pregnancies were carefully monitored. Physicians kept meticulous notes on her health, dietary habits, and physical condition, offering a mix of practical advice and ritualistic remedies. Herbal tonics, controlled diets, and regimented rest were prescribed, alongside prayers and ceremonial observances intended to ensure the favor of God, balancing the limitations of her own body with the social and political imperatives of her position. Each adjustment, each precaution, was a calculated effort to fulfill her duty and preserve her status. Beyond the medical interventions, Catherine had to navigate the court's scrutiny. Every visible change in her appearance, every public absence or delayed ceremony could become a subject of speculation. Courtiers whispered, advisors observed, and rival families watched for signs of weakness or failure. In this environment, Catherine learned to control perception as carefully as she controlled her health, maintaining composure, masking discomfort, and demonstrating the qualities expected of a queen. Even in the private trials of pregnancy, the timing of pregnancies carried political significance. The birth of a male heir, in particular, was a matter of national importance. France's stability, succession, and alliances depended on the certainty of legitimate heirs. Catherine understood that the success of her pregnancies would affect her own influence, the security of her children, and the broader calculations of power among noble families. Each pregnancy was an intersection of personal endurance and national consequence, delicate balance that required careful attention to both physical and social factors. Religious observance played a crucial role in this delicate balance. Catherine's piety was both genuine and performative. Prayers, fasting, and attendance at ceremonies reinforced her image as a virtuous, dutiful queen. These acts served multiple purposes: They demonstrated moral integrity, reassured the court of her devotion, and provided a framework through which she could manage the uncertainties of fertility and pregnancy. In a world where divine favor was considered essential to success, Catherine's religious observance was inseparable from her political and personal strategy. Catherine's growing skill in observation became an essential tool in managing both her pregnancies and her position at court. She learned to read subtle cues from courtiers, physicians, and advisors' intonation, expression, or hesitation, often revealing concerns, ambitions, or biases. These observations allowed her to act strategically, smoothing tensions, reinforcing alliances, and managing perceptions. In effect, her pregnancies became a lens through which she honed the subtle exercise of influence that would define her. The king's involvement was also critical. Henry, while still young, had begun to value Catherine's judgment and recognized her careful attention to detail. He was aware that the successful birth of heirs strengthened the dynasty and stabilized the court. Catherine's ability to guide him subtly, to anticipate his reactions, and to manage the social implications of each pregnancy became a cornerstone of her emerging authority. Their relationship, rooted in observation, trust, and strategic intervention, grew in complexity as the stakes of succession became increasingly apparent. Catherine's Lascaux's personal resilience was tested repeatedly. Miscarriages, complications, and the physical demands of pregnancy were realities that she had to endure quietly. Each setback was both emotionally and politically significant. The Queen learned to manage grief, maintain composure, and adapt strategies for future pregnancies, combining personal strength with political foresight. Through these experiences, she developed an intimate understanding of the inseparability of personal and political life. Realizing that endurance and observation were as vital as intelligence or status, even minor details in court life could influence the perception of her success or failure. Seating arrangements at banquets, participation in ceremonies, or attendance at religious observances signaled health, virtue, and capability. Catherine's meticulous attention to such details allowed her to project strength, competence, and continuity, even when personal challenges threatened to compromise her image. This careful management of appearance and perception became an essential aspect of her early strategy for survival and influence. By this stage, Catherine's reputation as a perceptive and disciplined queen was solidifying. Courtiers began to recognize that she possessed a combination of endurance, intelligence, and subtlety that made her a formidable figure even within the restrictive and scrutinized life of the queen. Yet, for all her successes, the pressures of pregnancy and the demands of producing heirs remained unrelenting. Each birth carried both relief and new responsibility, reinforcing her central role in the dynasty while highlighting the constant fragility of her position. And yet, despite careful planning, observation, and management, a lingering question persisted. Could Catherine navigate the intertwined pressures of pregnancy, courtly expectation, and political influence long enough to secure her family's future and ensure that her children would inherit a stable and enduring legacy? This uncertainty defined Catherine's early years as a mother-to-be and a queen, shaping her strategies, endurance, and subtle mastery of power. It was a period in which survival, influence, and legacy were inseparable. and in which the quiet exertion of observation and patience proved as essential as any formal authority. The births of Catherine de Medici's children marked the culmination of years of anxiety, careful observation, and strategic endurance. Each pregnancy had been a test not only of her physical resilience, but also of her ability to navigate the court's relentless scrutiny, manage her household, and maintain influence in a realm where the queen's worth was closely tied to the production of heirs. The arrival of each child was more than a personal milestone. It was a political event that shaped alliances, reinforced dynastic stability, and solidified Catherine's position within the monarchy. The birth of her first son, Francis, was a particularly pivotal moment. He represented not only the continuation of the Valois dynasty, but also a tangible affirmation of Catherine's ability to fulfill her most essential duty as queen. Courtiers and advisors watched the event with intense interest, noting the queen's health, the care provided by attendants, and the immediate response of the king. Catherine's careful attention to her own composure and public image during and after childbirth ensured that she emerged not only unscathed but strengthened in the perception of those around her with each subsequent child. Catherine's understanding of the interplay between motherhood and influence deepened. She recognized that her position as mother of the heirs gave her a unique form of authority, one that was both personal and political. Through her children, she could exercise indirect influence over the king, guide the formation of alliances, and subtly shape the court's priorities. Her role as mother became inseparable from her political strategy, allowing her to wield power in ways that extended beyond ceremonial duties or personal counsel. Yet these years were not without hardship. Childbirth in the 16th century was fraught with danger, and Catherine endured physical pain, medical uncertainty, and the ever-present fear of loss. Miscarriages and difficult deliveries reminded her of the fragility of life and the delicate balance required to maintain both personal health and political standing. Each challenge reinforced her resilience, patience, and careful management, perception skills that would serve her throughout her later life as she navigated crises, both personal and national. Catherine's experience as a mother also reshaped her engagement with the court. She became increasingly attuned to the ambitions, loyalties, and rivalries of noble families, understanding that her children's futures depended on alliances and support that extended beyond her immediate household. Through careful observation, selective patronage, and strategic guidance, she nurtured relationships that would protect her family and enhance her own influence. Her role as a mother allowed her to operate within a socially acceptable sphere while exercising a subtle but potent form of political power. Religious and ceremonial practices continued to play a significant role. Catherine's piety, expressed through prayers, attendance at Mass, and participation in rituals, reinforced her image as a virtuous and capable mother. These acts reassured the court and the kingdom that the dynasty was in capable hands, intertwining moral authority with dynastic stability. In the intricate web of courtly influence, perception was nearly as important as action, and Catherine's careful cultivation of image enhanced her standing as both queen and mother. The births of her children also introduced new responsibilities, overseeing their education, securing advantageous marriages for the future, and preparing them to navigate the complexities of French politics. Each decision regarding her children was infused with political calculation. By guiding their upbringing, Catherine extended her influence into the next generation, ensuring that her strategic foresight would shape not only her immediate power, but also the broader trajectory of the Valois dynasty. Catherine's growing authority, reinforced by her success as a mother, allowed her to act with increasing confidence in matters of governance and courtly strategy. She could intervene in disputes, offer counsel on alliances, and manage ceremonial events with greater assurance, while she still relied on subtlety, discretion, and observation. The tangible demonstration of her capacity to secure heirs strengthened her position in ways that words or appearances alone could not achieve. And yet, even as her influence expanded through motherhood, a persistent question remained. Could the stability and security that came with producing heirs endure in a court filled with ambition, intrigue, and the unpredictable whims of nobles and kings alike? This question would continue to shape Catherine's decisions and strategies for years to come. Her early experiences with childbirth, motherhood, and dynastic responsibility provided not only immediate influence, but also the foundational skills she would later use to navigate crises, protect her family, and wield power in a kingdom constantly on the brink of upheaval. Through endurance, observation, and strategic subtlety, Catherine de Medici transformed the personal challenge of producing heirs into a mechanism for lasting influence, demonstrating that quiet mastery of duty could secure both survival and authority in the often perilous world of the French court. Story 5. Catherine's relationship with the nobility. By the time Catherine de Medici had established herself as a mother and a perceptive presence at court, she began to confront another enduring challenge: the complex web of noble families whose influence shaped the fate of France. The French nobility was not a unified class, but a collection of powerful factions, each with its own ambitions, rivalries, and strategies. To secure her position and protect her children, Catherine had to learn the delicate art of navigating these alliances and rivalries, a task that demanded patience, observation, and subtlety at every turn. The court was a stage upon which these dynamics were constantly displayed. Every banquet, tournament, or public ceremony offered a glimpse into the hierarchy of influence. Some families wielded power through proximity to the king, others through military or administrative authority, and still others through marriage and familial alliances. Catherine quickly realized that understanding the ambitions and vulnerabilities of each noble house was essential. She needed to discern who could be relied upon, who might betray her interests, and who could be subtly guided to align with her goals. Catherine's approach was rarely confrontational. She preferred observation and subtle intervention, allowing nobles to reveal their priorities through speech, gestures, and behavior. By listening carefully to conversations, noting alliances formed in whispers, and tracking the outcomes of minor disputes, she gathered information that allowed her to act strategically. Even small acts, such as offering a thoughtful gift, granting attention in a ceremonial setting, or mediating a minor quarrel, could reinforce loyalty, create debt of gratitude, or shift perceptions in her favor. Marriage alliances were another critical tool in her strategy. Catherine understood that her children's future positions and by extension her own security, depended on forging ties with influential families. She carefully considered proposals, observing the reputations, loyalties, and ambitions of potential partners. These decisions were never purely personal. They were calculated moves within a larger political chessboard. Through strategic marriages, Catherine could consolidate alliances, neutralize rival factions, and extend her influence across generations. Yet the nobility could also be a source of threat. Powerful families sometimes viewed the queen's growing influence as a challenge to their own authority. Jealousy, suspicion, and rivalry were constant features of court life. Catherine learned to navigate these tensions through diplomacy and discretion. By rewarding loyalty, demonstrating fairness in arbitration, and avoiding overt favoritism, she managed to maintain a delicate balance between asserting authority and minimizing the risk of backlash. Observation and patience remained her most powerful tools. Catherine often noticed patterns of behavior invisible to others: a fleeting glance between allies, the subtle avoidance of a conversation, or the careful phrasing of a request. These cues allowed her to anticipate conflicts, preempt challenges, and subtly guide the ambitions of others to align with her own objectives. Over time, she developed a reputation for sagacity and discretion, qualities that reinforced her influence without requiring open confrontation or force. Religious puissance also shaped noble relationships. France was increasingly divided between Catholics and Protestants, and factionalism often intersected with familial ambition. Catherine, a devout Catholic, had to navigate these divisions carefully. She understood that overt partisanship could alienate powerful families or provoke unrest, while neutrality or subtle guidance could protect her interests and those of her children. Her skill lay in balancing moral, social, and political considerations, ensuring that her alliances were stable. Even in the face of growing religious tension, Catherine's household and patronage networks offered additional avenues for influence. By positioning allies in strategic roles, supporting artists or administrators loyal to her, and cultivating networks of information and favor, she strengthened her hand indirectly. Each minor act of attention or reward could reinforce loyalty and expand her influence, while a carefully timed withdrawal of favor could signal disapproval without sparking overt conflict. These subtle mechanisms allowed her to shape outcomes and maintain authority in ways that were largely invisible yet highly effective. Through these early experiences, Catherine began to demonstrate a remarkable ability to combine patience, observation, and strategic intervention. She understood that the nobility was not merely a social class, but a complex system of influence, ambition, and expectation. Her role as Queen and as mother to the heirs of France required her to manage these dynamics continuously, navigating a landscape in which miscalculation could have severe consequences. Yet even as she built alliances and mitigated rivalries, a persistent question remained. Could Catherine maintain stability among powerful and often unpredictable noble families, ensuring loyalty to the crown and the security of her children, without exposing herself to the risks of intrigue and betrayal that defined court life? This question underscored the subtlety and danger inherent in the Queen's interactions with the nobility. It also highlighted the enduring lesson of Catherine's early years, that influence, survival, and the consolidation of power often depended less on overt authority than on patience, strategic observation, and the careful management of human relationships. As Catherine de Medici's children grew and her presence at court solidified, she began to confront the more tangible challenges of managing the French nobility. Families whose ambitions once seemed distant or symbolic now directly intersected with her own influence, her children's futures, and the stability of the monarchy. In this complex environment, Catherine had to move beyond observation and subtle signaling into more active management of conflicts, rivalries, and alliances. One of the most pressing issues involved the Guise and Montmorency, families two of France's most powerful factions. The Guises were staunch Catholics, ambitious, and closely linked to military power, while the Montmorencys wielded influence through administrative and regional control. Each family sought to assert dominance at court, and their rivalry threatened both political stability and the Queen's authority. Catherine recognized that navigating this tension required diplomacy, discretion, and the careful use of her growing influence over the king and the court. Catherine's strategy often relied on timing. She would allow minor disputes to surface just enough to gauge loyalties and ambitions. Observing how families reacted to pressure, negotiation, or opportunity, by remaining patient and attentive, she could anticipate moves and intervene at moments that maximized the benefit to her position. Even a casual word, a strategically placed gift, or a seemingly trivial favor could shift loyalties and reinforce her authority. Her approach was never about confrontation for its own sake. It was about shaping the environment to secure stability for the crown and her. Family-marriage alliances remained a key instrument of control. Catherine orchestrated unions not merely to cement personal relationships, but to strategically balance power among rival families. By aligning her children with influential houses or neutralizing potential threats through carefully arranged matches, she extended her influence across multiple factions. These actions required long-term planning, extensive observation, and careful negotiation skills Catherine had honed since her arrival in France. Yet even with meticulous planning, Catherine had to navigate personal rivalries and jealousies that could erupt unpredictably. Courtiers might resent her foreign origins, her influence over the king, or her perceived favoritism. Catherine addressed these challenges through subtle assertion. She rewarded loyalty, mediated disputes, and occasionally used ceremonial occasions to signal approval or disapproval. These interventions were calculated, invisible to the unobserved, yet highly effective in reinforcing her authority without sparking open conflict. Religious tensions further complicated Catherine's relationship with the nobility. Protestant and Catholic families often clashed, and allegiances could shift with alarming speed. Catherine's role required careful balance. She could not overtly alienate one faction without risking unrest. Yet neutrality alone could weaken her authority. She learned to guide outcomes indirectly, influencing court decisions, marriages, and appointments in ways that maintained peace while reinforcing her family's interests. Her interventions were rarely publicized, but their effects reverberated through the court. Instruments of influence, loyal courtiers, attendants, and advisors acted as conduits of information, allowing her to monitor factional dynamics and anticipate potential conflicts. She used these networks to reward loyalty, mitigate disputes, and subtly encourage behaviors aligned with her strategic goals. In this way, her influence extended beyond direct interaction with the nobility, creating a web of loyalty and obligation that strengthened her position at court. Personal relationships were another essential tool. Catherine cultivated allies who shared her vision, her patience, and her understanding of subtle power. She nurtured trust, exercised discretion, and carefully chose confidants who could relay information, mediate disputes, or advocate on her behalf. By building these human networks, Catherine expanded her authority without relying solely on formal power or ceremonial displays. Even as her influence grew, Catherine remained acutely aware of the precariousness of her position. Ambition, envy, and miscalculation could destabilize her carefully constructed alliances. A single misstep, a misread signal, an ill-timed intervention, or an unchecked rivalry had the potential to unravel months of strategy. Her success depended on continuous vigilance, patience, and the disciplined application of her knowledge of courtly dynamics. Through these experiences, Catherine demonstrated a remarkable capacity for strategic foresight. She transformed the complex rivalries of the nobility into a manageable system of influence, using observation, timing, and subtle action to maintain stability and protect her family. Her skill lay in recognizing the often invisible levers of power, intervening in ways that shaped outcomes without provoking overt confrontation, and ensuring that her authority remained respected and unchallenged. Yet, even as she honed these strategies, an unresolved question lingered. Could Catherine's careful management of noble factions endure in a court where ambition, jealousy, and the unpredictable temperaments of powerful families constantly threatened to destabilize both her influence and the monarchy itself? This question underscored the inherent tension in Catherine's early political life. Her mastery of subtle influence allowed her to navigate dangerous waters, but the constant uncertainty of noble rivalries would demand ever greater skill, patience, and foresight in the years to come. It was a lesson in the quiet, persistent labor of power, where success depended not on force, but on vigilance, strategy, and the subtle shaping of human behavior. By the time Catherine de Medici had navigated multiple pregnancies and established her presence as queen and mother of heirs, she had also begun to consolidate her influence over the French nobility. What had started as careful observation and subtle management of relationships evolved into a more deliberate exercise of power, though never in a way that drew overt confrontation or resentment. Catherine understood that in a court dominated by ambition, the appearance of neutrality, discretion, and fairness was as vital as actual authority. Her consolidation of influence relied heavily on the strategic use of ceremony, patronage, and mediation. Banquets, balls, and festivals were more than displays of wealth or tastes. They were opportunities to reinforce hierarchies, reward loyalty, and guide alliances. Catherine carefully considered seating arrangements, the allocation of honors, and the distribution of gifts. Every choice was a calculated signal: approval, caution, or subtle discouragement. Courtiers soon recognized that her attention to these details was deliberate, and that their position in her disfavor carried implications for influence and opportunity at court. Marriage alliances remained central to her strategy. By arranging unions for her children with influential families, Catherine could weave networks of loyalty across rival factions. These unions were rarely about personal preference. They were political instruments, crafted to secure the stability of her children's positions and to reinforce her authority. Each marriage subtly reconfigured the balance of power among the nobility, extending her influence in ways that were largely invisible but profoundly effective. Catherine also increasingly engaged in direct mediation of noble conflicts. When rivalries threatened to escalate into open disputes, she acted as a discreet arbiter, guiding negotiations and offering counsel in ways that preserved both the crown's authority and the stability of factions. Her ability to remain impartial or to appear impartial enhanced her credibility, positioning her as a stabilizing force in a court often torn by jealousy, ambition, and suspicion. Religious divisions continued to influence her relationships with the nobility. As the kingdom became increasingly divided between Catholics and Protestants, Catherine's ability to navigate these tensions became a critical tool of influence. She acted as both guide and mediator, ensuring that religious loyalties did not undermine alliances or provoke unnecessary conflict. Her discretion allowed her to manage the court's divided factions, subtly aligning them with the interests of the crown while minimizing overt confrontation. Catherine's patronage networks grew increasingly sophisticated. Courtiers, attendants, and loyal officials served as extensions of her influence, relaying information, facilitating negotiations, and reinforcing her guidance. Through these networks, she could monitor developments, reward loyalty, and intervene strategically without needing to assert authority openly. Influence, in Catherine's hands, became a system of interconnected relationships, an invisible web through which she shaped outcomes, mitigated threats, and secured her family's position. Personal skill remained at the heart of Catherine's approach. Her patience, discretion, and careful observation allowed her to read intentions and anticipate challenges. She recognized that power at court was rarely about confrontation. It was about perception, timing, and the subtle orchestration of human behavior. By shaping circumstances indirectly, she could achieve results that direct action alone might have jeopardized. Over time, this mastery of courtly nuance became a defining feature of her political strategy. Catherine's consolidation of influence over the nobility also created a sense of resilience. While ambition, jealousy, and rivalry remained constant, her careful cultivation of loyalty, her strategic use of ceremonies and patronage, and her ability to mediate conflicts established her as an indispensable figure in courtly life. Courtiers learned that her judgment mattered, that her attention was deliberate, and that her influence could not be ignored. This authority was subtle but enduring, rooted in observation, patience, and strategic foresight rather than force or ostentation. Yet, even as her position strengthened, a lingering uncertainty persisted. Could Catherine maintain her delicate balance of influence, loyalty, and mediation over the fractious French nobility, ensuring the stability of the crown and the security of her children in a court where ambition and intrigue were constant and unpredictable? This question underscored the perpetual challenge of Catherine's life. Her consolidation of authority was not a single achievement but an ongoing process, requiring vigilance, adaptability, and constant attention to the subtleties of human behavior. Through her mastery of observation, negotiation, and strategic action, Catherine de Medici transformed the management of noble relationships from a potential threat into a powerful instrument of influence, an instrument that would define her role in French politics for decades to come. Story 6: Catherine and the religious tensions in France. By the mid-16th century, France was becoming increasingly fractured by religious differences. The rise of Protestantism, particularly the Huguenot movement, introduced a complex set of social, political, and personal challenges that threatened both the stability of the monarchy and the cohesion of the French court. For Catherine de Medici, already navigating the subtleties of noble rivalries and the pressures of motherhood, the religious tension presented an entirely new and delicate challenge, one that required careful observation, patience, and unprecedented political acumen. Catherine's position as queen placed her at the intersection of competing forces. She was a devout Catholic, yet she was acutely aware that the growing Protestant movement included some of the most influential noble families in France. The Montmorencys and other Huguenot-lined houses held military and political power, making any overt suppression of their influence potentially dangerous. At the same time, staunch Catholic factions, including the powerful Guise family, demanded strict adherence to orthodoxy and were often impatient with compromise or tolerance. Balancing these competing pressures was not merely a matter of personal discretion. It was a critical aspect of preserving the monarchy and protecting her children's succession. Catherine quickly realized that religion in France was inseparable from politics. A noble's faith was a signal of loyalty, influence, and ambition, while religious observance or deviation could shift alliances and spark conflict. Even seemingly private practices, such as attending a Protestant service or expressing sympathy for a Huguenot family, were potentially politically charged. Catherine began to observe these patterns meticulously, noting who might shift allegiance, who could be persuaded toward moderation, and who might pose a threat if tensions escalated. The Queen also recognized the importance of perception. Her role demanded that she appear morally upright and devout to the Catholic majority, while avoiding actions that could provoke outright rebellion from Protestant nobles. Religious neutrality, or at least careful mediation, became a cornerstone of her strategy. Catherine began cultivating relationships with moderate figures in both camps, seeking counsel and understanding motivations without committing publicly to one side. This careful balance allowed her to act as a stabilizing figure in a court. Increasingly polarized by faith, the court itself reflected the broader societal tension. Conversations, alliances, and social rituals were often infused with religious undertones. A jest, a casual remark, or a seating arrangement at a banquet could be interpreted as a statement of loyalty or dissent. Catherine's skill in observation, honed over years of navigating noble rivalries, now became essential for understanding the undercurrents of religious sentiment. She noted who avoided particular company, who sought counsel discreetly, and who strategically aligned themselves in both public and private contexts. These observations informed her decisions and allowed her to anticipate potential conflicts before they erupted. Early instances of religious conflict provided both warning and opportunity. Minor disputes between Catholic and Protestant nobles occasionally escalated into localized skirmishes, threatening the delicate balance of power. Catherine's interventions were subtle but deliberate. She mediated disputes privately, guided discussions to ensure the king's authority was respected, and rewarded behavior that promoted moderation or compromise. Through these acts, she reinforced her role as a stabilizing presence, demonstrating that her authority extended beyond ceremonial duties and into the realm of practical governance. At the same time, Catherine's personal piety and adherence to Catholic rituals served as both shield and signal. By visibly participating in Mass, fasting, and other religious observances, she reassured Catholic factions of her devotion, preventing accusations of favoritism toward Protestant houses. Yet her careful discretion in private interactions with Huguenot nobles ensured that potential allies remained open to dialogue, preserving channels of influence that might be critical if conflict escalated further. The Queen's management of these early tensions also required an understanding of the broader social impact of religious division. Towns, regions, and even families were increasingly influenced by the shifting allegiances of faith. Catherine noted patterns of unrest, economic disruption, and emerging leadership among Protestant communities, considering how these factors might affect national stability. Her observations were meticulous, often recorded mentally or through her trusted attendants, forming the foundation of strategies she would employ in the years to come. Even amidst these challenges, Catherine was aware of the personal dimension of religious conflict. Her children's safety and succession were intimately tied to the loyalty of the nobles around them. Any failure to manage religious tensions could endanger her family, destabilize the monarchy, or ignite rebellion. This dual responsibility, protecting her children while maintaining national stability, required constant vigilance, patience, and strategic subtlety. Yet, despite her growing skill in observation, mediation, and subtle influence, Catherine confronted a lingering and pressing question. Could she reconcile the competing demands of Catholic and Protestant factions in a court increasingly defined by division, while safeguarding her children's future and preserving the authority of the crown? This question framed Catherine's early engagement with the religious crises of France. Her approach in these formative years, rooted in careful observation, discreet intervention, and the cultivation of alliances across faith lines, would set the stage for the profound challenges that awaited her, revealing both her skill and the fragile balance she was tasked with maintaining. As France moved deeper into the 16th century, religious tensions transformed from subtle rivalries into tangible, sometimes violent conflict. The Huguenots, inspired by Protestant reformers, were gaining influence among the nobility and urban centers, while Catholic factions, particularly the Guise family, resisted any compromise. For Catherine de Medici, the Queen and mother of heirs, this period marked a turning point. Her careful observation and subtle influence would be tested in circumstances that could threaten the monarchy itself. One of the first indicators of escalation came in the form of regional unrest. Towns with significant Huguenot populations saw growing tensions with neighboring Catholic communities. Disputes over worship spaces, local governance, and tax obligations often flared into skirmishes, with both sides interpreting the actions of the crown as implicit support for the other. Catherine, ever attentive began compiling knowledge from courtiers, envoys, and local officials about these disputes, recognizing patterns that could signal wider instability. Her intelligence gathering was meticulous, because early awareness could allow for interventions that might prevent the outbreak of large-scale violence. The Queen's role as mediator became increasingly critical. Courtiers appealed to her discretion, nobles sought guidance in conflicts, and even the king depended on her counsel when decisions could provoke unrest. Catherine's approach combined patience, negotiation, and subtle signaling. She intervened in ways that appeared neutral yet reinforced royal authority, emphasizing compromise, moderation, and the protection of the crown's overarching interests. Each action was calculated. The appearance of fairness was as crucial as the result itself, because perception shaped alliances, loyalty, and the potential for rebellion. Catherine's personal interactions with key Huguenot leaders were conducted with careful attention to nuance. She offered discreet counsel, invited dialogue, and at times allowed minor concessions that would maintain the appearance of goodwill without compromising her family's position. These efforts were delicate. Any overt favoritism toward one side could provoke violent backlash from the other. Catherine's skill lay in balancing these risks, ensuring that both Catholic and Protestant factions remained sufficiently appeased to prevent immediate conflict, even as underlying tensions persisted. Religious violence in Paris and other urban centers began to provide stark reminders of the stakes involved. Even small disturbances could escalate quickly, fueled by rumor, fear, or retaliation. Catherine understood that the Queen's authority, while significant in ceremonial terms, relied heavily on her ability to influence human behavior indirectly. By cultivating alliances, guiding negotiations, and monitoring emerging threats, she worked to mitigate outbreaks before they undermined the crown's authority or endangered her children. The king's role further complicated Catherine's efforts. Henry, while still young, was expected to uphold Catholic orthodoxy, yet maintain the loyalty of Protestant nobles, whose support was politically indispensable. Catherine's guidance helped temper his responses, framing decisions in ways that reinforced royal authority without alienating key factions. She became the stabilizing presence behind his throne, the subtle hand-shaping policy and perception alike, and the quiet strategist managing both domestic and religious politics. Catherine also learned that perception of impartiality was critical. Public ceremonies, court events, and her personal presence were all carefully managed to reinforce an image of neutrality. Even seemingly minor gestures, such as seating arrangements at Mass, public acknowledgments, or the distribution of favor, sent signals that nobles interpreted as statements of loyalty, alliance, or tolerance. Catherine's mastery of these subtleties became a vital tool in maintaining control over a fractious court and a divided nation. At the same time, her household served as an instrument of influence. Trusted courtiers and advisors acted as her eyes and ears, gathering information about regional disputes, courtly sentiment, and potential threats. This network allowed Catherine to act preemptively, rewarding loyalty, discouraging hostility, and ensuring that she could intervene in crises before they escalated. The Queen's influence, in this sense, extended beyond visible power. It operated through information, observation, and strategic guidance. shaping outcomes without requiring force. Even as she navigated these escalating tensions, Catherine was acutely aware of the personal stakes. The safety of her children, the stability of the monarchy, and the survival of her family were intimately tied to the outcome of these conflicts. Each decision carried the weight of potential disaster, and even minor miscalculations could have profound consequences. Her endurance, discretion, and patient observation were tested repeatedly, revealing both the fragility and resilience of her position. Despite her careful mediation and strategic foresight, an unresolved question remained. Could Catherine maintain her influence and protect her family as religious tensions escalated toward open civil war? Or would the divisions within France overwhelm even the most careful and subtle exercise of power? This question would define the next stage of Catherine de Medici's political life. Her early experience in mediating noble rivalries and balancing religious tensions laid the groundwork for the extraordinary challenges to come, where survival, influence, and the protection of her dynasty would be inseparably intertwined. As the 16th century progressed, the religious tensions Catherine de Medici had carefully observed and managed began to erupt into open conflict. France was increasingly divided between Catholic and Protestant factions, and even minor disputes could escalate into violence that threatened not only the stability of the monarchy, but also the safety of her children. For Catherine, these years demanded a delicate balance of strategic intervention, subtle influence, and careful policy management tasks that would define her political life and reputation. The outbreak of violence in various regions of France underscored the fragility of social cohesion. Cities with significant Huguenot populations saw protests, disruptions in governance, and clashes between armed factions. Reports of skirmishes, property damage, and local uprisings reached the royal court, and Catherine faced the constant challenge of deciding when to intervene, how to respond, and how to signal authority without provoking further unrest. Her decisions were guided by observation, careful analysis, and the subtle calibration of action and perception. Catherine increasingly relied on her role as mediator. She convened discussions between rival factions, invited trusted advisors to assess the situation, and implemented compromises that reinforced the crown's authority while limiting open conflict. Her interventions were rarely dramatic or publicized. Instead, they relied on discretion, negotiation, and careful management of loyalties. In doing so, she maintained a perception of impartiality, reassuring both Catholic and Protestant factions that their interests would be considered. Even as she subtly advanced the monarchy's priorities, the Queen also recognized the importance of timing. Early, decisive action could prevent small disputes from escalating, but misjudged intervention might inflame tensions. Catherine's patience allowed her to gauge the temperaments of key figures, the likelihood of escalation, and the potential for compromise. She often waited for the right moment to act, ensuring that her decisions were both effective and politically sustainable. This approach required constant vigilance and a deep understanding of human behavior, alliances, and the nuances of courtly influence. Her children's safety remained a paramount concern. Each outbreak of religious violence posed a direct threat to their lives and future succession. Catherine's interventions, therefore, were not only political but intensely personal. She guided her family through these turbulent years with careful attention to security, alliances, and the cultivation of loyalty among those tasked with their protection. The intertwining of personal responsibility and political strategy became a defining characteristic of her approach to governance. Catherine also understood the broader social and economic impact of religious conflict, trade disruptions, local rebellions, and the destabilization of regional governance threatened to erode the monarchy's authority and undermine the crown's legitimacy. Her policies, while subtle, addressed these dimensions, using patronage, mediation, and careful signaling to maintain order and reinforce loyalty among nobles and regional leaders. By addressing both the human and systemic aspects of unrest, Catherine shaped a response that was multifaceted, deliberate, and deeply informed. The Queen's religious policy during this period reflected a mixture of pragmatism and cautious neutrality. She avoided overt favoritism, instead emphasizing moderation, compromise, and the crown's overarching authority. Her visible piety reassured Catholic factions, while her discreet engagement with Huguenot nobles maintained channels for dialogue and influence. This careful balancing act allowed her to prevent immediate disasters and buy time for more comprehensive strategies, though it also meant living under constant uncertainty and scrutiny. Even within the court, Catherine's management of religious tensions demonstrated her strategic acumen. She monitored alliances, mediated disputes, and rewarded loyalty while discouraging dissent. Courtiers quickly learned that her attention was deliberate, that her judgments were measured, and that her influence extended far beyond ceremonial authority. Through subtle observation and careful intervention, she shaped outcomes in a fractious environment, reinforcing her role as a stabilizing force in a kingdom increasingly defined by division. Yet, despite her skill and careful management, a persistent and troubling question lingered. Could Catherine's delicate balancing act hold as the country edged closer to full-scale civil war? Or would the forces of religious division overwhelm her influence, threatening the monarchy, her family, and the fragile stability she had worked so hard to maintain? This question marked the end of the early phase of Catherine's engagement with France's religious tensions. Her efforts to mediate, setting the stage for events that would test her endurance, patience, and political mastery in ways no courtly intrigue or noble rivalry had before. The lessons learned during this period about subtlety, observation, and the careful exercise of influence would become the foundation of Catherine de Medici's enduring, if controversial, role in French history. You've been listening to Boring Past Times, Catherine's World of Ceremonies. Whispers and uneasy truces may sound distant, yet its details, quiet, slow, and almost forgotten, shaped the lives of kings, queens, and ordinary people alike. As the candles burn low in the palaces of history, may these small, uneventful moments guide you gently into rest. Until next time, good night from Boring Past Times.